A decade ago, Taylor Swift released 1989, a career-changing and defining album. It marked her definitive shift from country to pop, served as a rebirth for her celebrity persona, and crafted an incredibly thought-out narrative from start to finish. Even 10 years later, this is the album that the general public most recognised Taylor for, with hits like Shake It Off, Bad Blood, and Blank Space, among many others, being inescapable staples of pop culture. A year ago, Taylor reclaimed her fifth studio album with the release of 1989, Taylor's Version, which, against all odds, outdid the original version's opening week sales, reaffirming not only the popularity of 1989, but its rightful place as one of the most awarded and critically acclaimed pop albums in history. Welcome to a very special episode of Swiftly Spoken, a fan-made Taylor Swift podcast in which we break down her lyrics, deep dive into full album retrospectives, and theorise about what may be coming next. As always, we are your hosts Lisa and Cameron, and we hope you join us as we travel back in time to 2014, 10 years ago, to remember, relive, and review one of Taylor's most pivotal eras. For this album retrospective, we're going to be deep diving into every single part of 1989, remembering the era, analysing the music track by track, revisiting Taylor's version, Vault songs from a year ago, and everything that added to what basically has become this pop perfection puzzle. It's going to be a hefty episode. We're going to try and explore as much as we can with as much detail as we can. So strap in, get ready for this one because we're very excited to be going over this decade-year-old album. Before we start, we'd like to give a few credits to some of the sources that we use to kind of compile all of this information. Firstly, we would like to give credits to Effie, also known as Taylor on Your Dash, over on Tumblr. We'll be linking her timeline to 1989, which is like this really well looked into and sourced timeline of how Taylor chronologically created 1989, which is such an interesting read, so we do recommend if you want to go and check that out. We also got a lot of this information from the Lover Journals, which have become a treasure trove for Taylor Swift fans. The track-by-track secret sessions she did, her Grammy Museum showcase, all of it helped us with compiling everything that is going to be this episode, exploring all of 1989. The first thing we want to do is, in order to understand how 1989 came to be, we want to briefly revisit some of the Red era, because everything basically hinged on how Red was received. As Taylor herself stated during her interview for Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums a few years ago that celebrated Red, she said basically outright that Red was the reason why 1989 happened.
Taylor has always had pop sensibilities in her early music. I think Fearless is like a perfect example of this. And then within Red, Taylor greatly developed those pop sensibilities. Red was a very eclectic patchwork quilt of music, and Taylor even said so on the Apple Music little deluxe memo, where she chats about Red of being this kind of mosaic of different emotions, sonic sounds, ranging from like stripped back country straight to radio pop friendly hits. And I think what's interesting is that Taylor's version leans heavily into this country sound, highlighting her songwriting processes with All Too Well, as well as also leaning into the more pop sensibilities of Message in a Bottle or The Very First Night, and it just shows how eclectic and all over Red was.
Even so, like you said, All Too Well 10-minute version became like the star, the crowning jewel of the Red Taylor's version era, but originally that was very much not part of the promotional cycle for Red. Red was very much pop. It really was. We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, I Knew You Were Trouble, 22. However, and this is going to be something that is also of great importance when we look at how Taylor changed her career during 1989, Big Machine were adamant in creating country remixes for all of those songs, and it was very strange to hear We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together with this kind of country sound
weird,
to
like,
it.
Yeah, twang, and they were adamant that this album had to be listed as country.
Yes.
Whereas now I believe it's kind of listed, the Taylor's version is listed as pop, whereas at the time it was country. It was pushed on all the country awards. It was up for like country album of the year. It was never ever pushed as pop, even though sonically it definitely leaned more into pop with the singles that they were choosing, and the kind of promotion cycle was this major pop album, even though Big Machine were adamant this was country. What's interesting was Taylor faced major criticism because of this, and the album was basically, a lot of the discussion was the fact that it lacked sonical cohesion, obviously words that would become very kind of infamous during the 1989 era and promotion. She was during this era under a hell of a lot of scrutiny for her relationships. A lot of negative press and sexist kind of narratives were starting to swirl up around her private life, which then started to shift into her professional career and basically was being used as a way to diminish her songwriting. Oh, she only writes about exes. That was the major news outlet during basically the entirety of the Red era. And all of this came to a massive head at the 56 Grammy Awards held in January of 2014, when Red was obviously nominated for Album of the Year. And as Taylor revealed in her Lover Diary, she said, quote, that it's the middle of the night and I was at the Clive Davis party tonight, which means the Grammys are tomorrow. Never have I felt so good about our chances. Never have I wanted something as badly as I want to hear them say Red is album of the year. And I think what's interesting is also Taylor later spoke, I believe at the Grammy Museums, about how everyone kept coming up to her being like, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this. And unfortunately, obviously, Red lost instead to Random Access Memories, with a kind of very iconic moment where the R was dragged out and Taylor jumped thinking she'd won it. With that in mind, when speaking about her approach making 1989 and the massive shift from country to pop, she said that she wanted to make sure that this album, 1989, was different than anything she'd done before, and she was naturally gravitating towards more pop sensibilities and expanding that way. But it wasn't until about a year in that she admitted to herself and her team that this was a pop album and that they couldn't call it country. The genre had to be pop. And I think what's so interesting is, and maybe something that Taylor doesn't experience anymore, was Big Machine used to push back on everything, and Taylor really, really had to fight for her decisions, and the fact that she was able to fight and persuade them to move into pop was very scandalous.
It was big. It was a big
major,
moment. And it's funny because obviously from 2019 onwards, where we've seen this different aspect and different relationship between her and Big Machine. Before that, I don't know, it was kind of like glossed over. We found it like, here's an interesting anecdote from the era, because in all of these interviews that we've rewatched, she does bring it up. Yes, I had to fight tooth and nail. Yes, I had to stand in there and say, no, there will not be one country song on the album. This is going to be pop. This is going to be this. This is going to be that. And that was actually a horrible thing to have to go through.
Must have been quite heated. It sounded quite, when you look back at it, you realise that there was definitely kind of cracks in the relationship before the big blowout with, you know, the selling of the masters, definitely. And Taylor was very open and honest throughout the 1989 era that she fought tooth and nail to have a pop album, and like you said, have, you know, change the collaborators, change the kind of promotion, the vision and everything, because Big Machine were and still are a country label.
The year in mark that Taylor mentions in the quote is basically what we can ultimately line up with the fateful Grammy Awards. As can be seen, those Grammy Awards really were an important cornerstone to lead to the decision of 1989 becoming her first fully fledged pop album. In spite of the pushback from the label and the fears of alienating a massive audience, her mind had been made up and things were about to be set in motion. Before we go into the tracks from 1989 one by one, taking into account its chronological creation as well as its major collaborators, we want to go over the general vision that Taylor had. Slowly but surely, she was coming up with the idea for this album and the overall thesis statement that she wanted to convey to us and her musical inspirations in order to understand the project as a whole. So firstly, some words that Cameron mentioned, they did become infamous. They also became synonymous with...
A bit of a meme.
Yeah, a bit of a meme, and synonymous with the 1989 era. Sonically cohesive. This was just something that Taylor really got to her. The criticism for Red, she sits down in that Grammy interview and she says, when you're faced with the backlash or faced with the criticism, you can either do one thing, the other. And one of the things that she said is accept that criticism and say, I've got to make something better then. I'm going to look back at what I have done previously and come up with something that will be accepted better, basically. One really interesting thing that she does do at that Grammy Museum showcase is she really highlights the sonically cohesive album that she had already produced previously, which was, for her, Fearless. And she goes over that and she really says, I wanted to make something like Fearless.
That whole Grammy, I always love it when people go to the like Grammy kind of showcases and stuff, because they are, at the end of the day, there's a reason why they're doing it. They're doing it to, you know, directly speak to the Grammy voters and audience. But Taylor was very clever on what she was doing. She showed them all those voice notes of how she wrote the songs, played the songs in the most gorgeous way, in a stripped back way that highlighted the lyricism and the strength of the lyricism. But then also she wanted to showcase the sonically cohesiveness of the album, the theme of the album, how much thought had been put into it, that basically it was like, come on, you have to give it to me. It was very, very clever the way that she was discussing that. And like you said, the fact that she pulled up Fearless, which obviously had won album of the year, and wanting to kind of match that emotion of Fearless and, you know, the cohesiveness of Fearless is a very interesting thing, and, you know, was not an accident. That was definitely thought out. No, I love these interviews. I love this showcase where she really, like you said, she shows all of these facets of 1989. Another thing that I thought was so interesting is that Miles McNutt, a professor in communications and arts, has described those voice memos as Taylor really making an effort to claim her authority over 1989, because it is true, especially back then, that a lot of producers were predominantly male, and she really wanted to make sure that nothing was going to happen like in the Fearless era again. No one was going to question her songwriting, and in this case, for this album, no one was going to question her production. She had been in there, she'd been with the producers, she was all over the whole album basically, and she wanted to make sure those voice notes were part of it. But this
interview in specific, she really goes into the nitty-gritty. She gives the names of microphones, the names of instruments, how they did this, that, and the other, how she came up with this, who's came up with that. And I think that's something, again, that we maybe overlooked during the era as something like, okay, yeah, so she's gone to pop and it's all very synthy. But she was really, really trying to be like, no, this is my album and I am deeply in the DNA of it. Definitely. Yep. Which leads us to the sound of the album. The second thing that we can say about this album is that, of course, it was very, very much inspired by 80s music. Talking to Billboard in 2014, Taylor mentioned that she had become obsessed with 80s sounds and synth pop. People like Peter Gabriel, Madonna, Annie Lennox, Sinead O'Connor. She was deeply inspired by these very, very creative artists and how they would reinvent themselves in that decade. So soon after those fateful Grammy Awards, she would tell the story that she would wake up in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. and she had a clear vision. She knew that she wanted to call this album 1989 after the year that she was born, and also because of the inspiration of that decade of music. She said that she'd been making 80s synth pop. She was going to stick with that. She's going to call it a fully fledged pop record. She's not going to be listening to anyone from her label, and she was going to start from that very next day. She wanted a small, tight team, and she wanted Max Martin and herself to oversee it all. And once again, she stated that they were going to make a sonically cohesive record. Finally, I think another very interesting thing is that her personal life changes were very, very much reflected in the album. This was an album for rebirth, but so was everything that she was doing in her life. And this was very much the forward of the original 1989, the prologue, emphasized all of this and how she had decided to move to New York, how she'd chopped off all of her hair, how she had a new outlook on fame and on love and on life. And the thing is, with 10 years of retrospective and the Taylor's version and all of the rest of it, I think now we can look back at it and say she was kind of faking it till she made it. Whereas in the Reclaimed era, she was in that position. She had finally made it to there.
And alongside that, the album design was also very, very important to the overall era and promotion of 1989. Obviously, the sound and name was chosen, and then therefore Taylor had to come up with the look of the album. And the main look with the original version was the Polaroid photo shoot in New York. She originally chose a different photo for the cover, and as revealed in the Lover journals, she had a dream that basically that original image wasn't good enough, and she became slightly unsure about it. And after going through the photo shoot, she found photo number 13, the photo of her in her obviously very iconic vintage seagull jumper, sitting against a beige wall with only her red lips visible. And later on Tumblr, Taylor commented on a post about a similar Polaroid in which the entire smiling face could be seen. She said that she had not chosen it because 1989 was all about the mystery. And I loved that that album that is so iconic and that cover that is so iconic was almost like a second thought. It wasn't the original image chosen, and that Taylor was so paranoid about anything being slightly wrong that the slight doubt in her mind, she said, no, I need to pick something else. And she went with that instead.
Every single detail of this album, she just like painstakingly poured her heart and soul into. She really did. And like just that small doubt in her head, that was enough to be like, no, it's got to be much more mysterious. Something that we need to bring up later when we get to those vault tracks and when we get to Taylor's version, which we have spoken about before in previous episodes, which we will be linking all of the other episodes that we've done surrounding 1989 to kind of like complete this retrospective. But Shrouded Mystery, it's so interesting how she wanted it to become something very mysterious. Like you wouldn't be able to read what 1989 was. You had to explore it with her.
I had to listen.
Yeah. Another way to explore that mystery of the album is, up until that point, Taylor had been creating secret messages for all of her albums and all of the songs on every single album. So, you know, from debut to Red, every single song had its own secret message that you could decipher by going through the lyric booklets, picking out the letters that were in capitals and finding the secret message that way. During the Red era, she had mentioned already that she had to try and be a bit more cryptic because people knew exactly what she was making reference to in those secret messages. And one thing that she does is she has a new approach to these secret messages during 1989. Instead of being these specific words or messages, they all come together to tell a story rather than give individual hints. Again, it adds to the mystery of the album and also the very tight storytelling of this album. So the story altogether, the secret messages, when you go through the track list in order, comes out to be: we begin our story in New York. There once was a girl known by everyone and no one. Her heart belonged to someone who couldn't stay. They loved each other recklessly. They paid the price. She danced to forget him. He drove past her street each night. She made friends and enemies. He only saw her in his dreams. Then one day he came back. Timing is a funny thing. and everyone was watching. She lost him, but she found herself, and somehow that was everything. It's just so interesting how she really wanted to break the mold.
I love them. They are so specific to the song when you kind of see it next to the song, but then the fact they tell this overall story is just so clever, and one of the most interesting secret messages she's ever done, definitely. And I think so pinnacle to 1989 that, again, like you said, this very polished, you know, this was not a secret message that was like a bit scandalous and sleazy and was someone's name. This was telling the story. This was still adding to the overall message that Taylor was trying to push out with this album, that it was solid, polished, well thought out, and, you know, she was over every aspect of.
And also the last secret messages that we ever got. Before we dive into the album track by track, we thought we'd just briefly mention that it was made from 2012 to 2014 and recorded in a variety of studios, including Conway Recording in Los Angeles, Jungle City in New York City, Lambie's House in Brooklyn, MXM in Stockholm, Pain in the Art in Nashville, Elevator Nobody in Gothenburg, and The Hideaway in London. For any fans of Lorde out there, you'll recognise Jungle City from the lyric, "I'm at Jungle City, it's late and this song is for you."
While the Grammy loss set a course for what her fifth studio album would become, as Taylor mentioned, she had already started working on music prior to January of 2014. In fact, we can trace the oldest 1989 song all the way back to October 17th in 2012, prior to the release of Red.
And that song is This Love. Not only does this song stand out because of when it was written, but it's the only solo write on 1989, and also the only song produced by Taylor's longtime country collaborator at that time, Nathan Chapman. If you would like to know more about this song, we have an episode completely dedicated to every single detail of This Love, which we'll be linking as well. This episode came out because This Love was re-recorded and released to promote The Summer I Turned Pretty in May of 2022. That was over a year and a half prior to the rest of the album being released, and it was kind of treated as the second promotional single to 1989 Taylor's version, the difference being that it was now produced by Christopher Rowe. While we get into everything on that episode, all of the original lyrics, how Taylor's version kind of differs in slight moments with the original version, and all of the history of that song, the important cliff note of it all is that This Love started off as a poem, which prompted a melody to enter Taylor's head and created the song. It's funny that this is like the first song from 1989 because it sets up a lot of themes that will be explored on 1989, including, of course, the major theme, which is that idea of this cyclical relationship with a lot of back and forth. The use of the ebb and the flow and the movement of water as a metaphor that really does come up throughout all of the album. For this song, Taylor did mention that it was the first time that she's really started experimenting with the different vocal recording styles. In this case, she wanted it to sound very haunting, and there's multiple vocals going throughout the entire song. She came up with this song prior to Red being released.
I know, which is mad, isn't it, when you think about it chronologically?
But it does fit on the album.
Yes, it doesn't stand out at all, which is interesting because obviously this was still at the time when technically she was making a country record and working with her country collaborators, and, you know, hadn't dared to tell Big Machine that she was moving into a pop world, but this song is still so pop and so 1989 and works with the whole theming of it. Two major elements of 1989 that have to be mentioned when discussing the album is obviously Max Martin and Shellback, the duo behind many major pop hits: Pink, Maroon 5, Ariana Grande, Britney Spears, the list goes on. But Taylor first met them during the Red era, and Taylor wanted Max Martin as a co-executive producer on 1989, and almost all of the Martin and Shellback songs actually, interestingly, went on to be produced by Christopher Rowe on the Taylor's version, which is quite interesting that Taylor was so insistent that Max had to be a major part of the creation of the original version of 1989, however, wasn't really seen in much of the Taylor's version of 1989.
From the information that we have, All You Had to Do Was Stay is the next song that Taylor made for 1989, and it's another confirmed date because we have a tweet from January the 10th, 2013, in which Taylor put "back in the studio, and she later confirmed that the song that she was mentioning, the song that she was working on as she wrote that tweet, was All You Had to Do Was Stay. She confirmed that on Tumblr. Track 5 was the second song that she made, and track 5 is, like, in Taylor Swift mythology, a lot of pressure is put on to that song. So I wonder if she knew that this was going to be the track 5 from the beginning. I know that, again, it wasn't as kind of like established in the fandom.
It was when there wasn't that much pressure. It was almost like a bit of a myth rather than like a law.
Right.
Whereas now it's like a
real thing.
It has to happen.
Yeah. Although I think, again, we've spoken about this before in our track 5 episode where we go over all of the track 5s. It does make sense for 1989 because of the vision of 1989, because of how she wanted it to sound, how she wanted it to look, what message she wanted it to convey. This one probably was the most vulnerable until we got the Vault tracks, so it kind of made sense. Again, it's another take on the back and forth relationship. This one is much more negative. When they come crawling back, the narrator is ready to reject them and just say, well, you should have stayed in the first place, which I will always remember the interview that Taylor did with Ryan Adams, who has his own version of 1989, in which she remarked on the fact that his version of All You Had to Do Was Stay was much more sad and like, please, the only thing you had to do, like begging, whereas her version was much more sassy and much more, well, you had one job and you didn't do it.
My favourite part of this song is always that it was inspired by a dream, and while talking with Ryan Adams, Taylor said that basically she had this dream that her ex had come to the door begging for her to talk to him, and she opened the door and that all she could say was this high-pitched stay, and basically she woke up from the dream and then recorded that part into the phone, which obviously then became a pinnacle element of the song. And it's fun because obviously while exploring pop, Taylor was able to play around with these weird noises and incorporate them into the songs, you know, which later on would involve things like Rat-a-ta-ta and I Did Something Bad, and I feel like All You Had to Do Was Stay, one of the first times of these weird kind of like noises and weird little kind of voice things were integral to the melody of the song.
There's a lot of waking up in the middle of the night from dreams in the 1989 era. She's doing a lot of...
Yes. We're in the Midnights era. You know what this is like.
She's having a lot of vivid dreams. Next up, song-wise, we have How You Get the Girl, which again, we have another specific date for. I love it when this happens because we get to know the proper chronology of how everything went down. So on January the 15th, 2013, again, Taylor posted on Instagram this time a picture of herself in the studio with the caption, "Somewhere in LA." Later on, she would reveal that she was writing How You Get the Girl. Again, she revealed it on Tumblr. This song, again, really, if you think about it, 1989 does tell kind of the same story and the same feelings, but from all of these different perspectives. And in this case, the perspective is the concept of Taylor literally laying out the exact steps that someone would have to take in order to get back the person that they lost from the back and forth that we have previously explored in the other two songs that she had created until that moment. Her explanation for this song is currently very relevant because during the Eras tour, many times in her Betty speeches, especially last year's leg in 2013, she would make a reference to How You Get the Girl and say, I've got songs in which I describe how you can apologize. And she would kind of compare the idea of what she describes in Betty to How You Get the Girl, and there's a link between them. I'm not sure if Betty, or James rather, took the advice very well, but I guess he did turn up at the party, so at least he did that.
So other songs that were made during 2013 include Bad Blood, and obviously this song details Taylor's feelings about feeling betrayed by someone who she believed to be friendly with. She describes it as a different kind of heartbreak. The song is widely known to be about Katy Perry, and from the get-go, Taylor did not want anyone to think that this song was about an ex. In an interview with Rolling Stone in 2014, she made it very clear that this was about another female artist, mentioning that she knows that people's minds go in one direction. For years, she said that she was never sure if she was friends with this person or not, as this person will come up to her at award shows and say something and walk away, and she would think, are we friends, or did she just give me the harshest insult of my life? Then last year, the other star apparently crossed the line. She did something so horrible, and Taylor said that she was like, oh, we're just straight up enemies. Basically what Taylor is referring to is that Katy had hired backup dancers out from under her while Taylor was in the middle of the Red Tour, and Taylor finally decided to retaliate. This song is kind of described as like the angriest song on the album, though it feels a lot more hurt in the solo version in comparison to the then remix version and single. So when it comes to the single, this was obviously remixed with Kendrick Lamar, who wrote his own verses, and then was accompanied by a stellar music video. And at the time, this version was like something we never really heard from Taylor. The remix version of Bad Blood was just like, as a fan at that time, was nuts. It was crazy. The music video went wild.
It was a full-on film production. You had so many people in it. Obviously, the infamous and kind of controversial at that time Squad was in it. You had Kendrick Lamar with that amazing addition to the song. And like you said, it's something that none of us had ever seen from her before, so it was very, very new. Bad Blood was obviously received very well because everyone knows the song, a lot of people do, but at the same time it caused a lot of drama in the fandom and fanned the flames of the Katy Perry feud that would eventually explode. Obviously now we know the end to this feud because thankfully everything was sorted out in the end and like made up. Katy has gone to the Eras tour. It's all very friendly, which we love to see.
They've been in the You Need to Come Down music video. It's all friends. It's all good and fun now.
But back then
was intense.
Yes, very.
And interestingly, while mentioning Kendrick Lamar, it would also be great to mention Taylor while releasing the deluxe version of 1989, Taylor's version, and the Kendrick Lamar remix of Bad Blood. She said that basically watching Kendrick create and record his verse on the Bad Blood remix was one of the most inspiring experiences of her life, and she still looks back on that collaboration with so much pride and gratitude for the ways that Kendrick elevated the song and the way he treats everyone everyone around him. And Taylor also mentioned how the Kendrick version has kind of become like this very important moment during the Eras tour as well, as fans obviously chant the line, "You forgive, you forget, but you never let it go." And Taylor is reminded of Kendrick every time people do that. And Taylor was obviously very happy that Kendrick would go back and re-record his verses for Bad Blood so that she could reclaim a work that she is obviously so proud of. This version for me is like another level. The production, the Kendrick remixes are insane, but the Taylor's version, Kendrick, fair play to him. He killed the original and he killed the Taylor's version. He absolutely like smashed it with the re-recording.
Yeah, he showed up. He really did show up, and that's another testament to the very important relationships that she made during the 1989 era, especially with songwriters and fellow creatives. Obviously, it's a different story when we get to Max Martin and Shellback. There isn't any bad blood, no pun intended, because we know that they still all get along very well. She did the Max Martin medley when he turned up for the Eras tour, so it is nice to always see other artists that collaborated originally returning, like Imogen Heap that we're going to get into in a minute, like Kendrick Lamar, like Colby Calais on Fearless, like Ed Sheeran, although that was always going to happen. But it's great to see that these people do very much stand behind her on these re-recordings, because again, now we have the hindsight of seeing how well they've done. A year ago when 1989 came out, it was absolutely incredible, the records it broke and the things that it did. But 2 years ago we did not, or even 3 years ago we did not know what was going to happen. Especially for Taylor, it must have been a bit nerve-wracking to undertake such a project. Next up, we have to speak about one of the biggest songs of 1989, which is Blank Space. Blank Space has basically become synonymous with the 1989 era. This one and Shake It Off, I think, are the biggest two that everyone thinks of when they think of this era. And it makes sense. It was turned again into this cinematic film that you could experience, and it was very, very satirical. Taylor leans into this persona that had been created for her during the Red era. Like we said, during that Red era, she was made out to be obsessive, boy crazy, calculating, a fatalistic romantic that would stop at nothing for love, and then would reap the benefits from her heartbreak by writing about her experiences in songs, which was made out to be a cheap trick, and she was not happy about this. So I'm glad that this was like the beginning of Reputation era Taylor. It was a defense mechanism, and it was a way to take this and turn it on its head. Taylor would say that she's realized that over the years that there's been a lot of sensational fictionalization of her personal life. They've drawn her out to be this serial dater who jet sets around the world with her boyfriends, and she can get them, but she can never really keep them because she's either too emotional or too needy. And then when she's heartbroken and they leave, she goes to her evil lair and writes songs about it for revenge. In Blank Space, she leans into this complex profile of a person, and she says, what would this person actually write? What would the song that she came up with sound like? And that is how she kind of made Blank Space. Another tidbit that she gave us during the Lover era, she basically said that Blank Space came about because she had a lot of different lyrics that she wrote in her notes app that she mashed together and really wanted to get out. And I think Blank Space is like that. Every single line is a hit. Blank Space is also very interesting when it comes to production. You can hear her in her recordings come up with a little pen click, which Max Martin and Shellback absolutely loved. You can also hear them screaming the O's in the back that kind of like become incorporated into the production of the song. She says that the Mellotron sounds became very important, but she focused much more on the lyrics of this one. She wanted everything to be just like zing after zing, lyric after lyric that was hard hitting. And while the production is very important in a lot of these songs, again, the lyrics for this one, they really do stand out. Next up, we have New Romantics. New Romantics is hopeful in the face of heartbreak. This one kind of like breaks the mold once again with Blank Space on the typical themes that she's been exploring. New Romantics celebrates independence and rebuilding yourself, and that rebirth that she really wanted to explore on 1989. And it makes sense because the title is a reference to the new romantic cultural movement from the UK that was most prominent in the 70s and 80s. It was inspired by artists like David Bowie. Music acts that became synonymous with the style were Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Boy George, and it's a direct reference to their synth pop from that sound that inspired 1989. It was lauded by critic Rob Sheffield as the song that showcased the most authentic tribute to 1980s pop on the album. For a long time, this was just a deluxe track.
Tiny little deluxe track on a Target CD, lost to the world.
Until it became the final single from 1989, and I think it was the perfect final single. It really did make the album and the era go out with a bang in the sense of song-wise, because a lot of other things were going on at that point. It was a perfect companion to the 1989 World Tour. It really encompassed that feeling of, again, rebirth and wanting to, in the face of so much going on, building a castle out of all the bricks that they throw at you, which is such a good line.
And I think what's interesting as well, talking about lyrics, is with the, obviously, re-recordings, with one of the versions of 1989, the ones that came with posters, we also got some original lyrics. Rose Garden version comes with the original lyrics for New Romantics.
We have, so take my hand, we'll both stand inside a burning building. I could be your anti-hero and you could be my perfect villain. Leave me cold, then keep me warm. Fall in love, then go to war. That's what New Romance is for. Completely different vibe going on there.
I know. So what's so interesting though is that obviously the anti-hero lyric, genuinely think Taylor's re-recording process of 1989 influenced Midnight's heavily.
The concept of an anti-hero coming back all those years later, that's just so interesting to me.
An original lyric that obviously didn't make the final cut is, maybe I'm a shit show, but I'm fun and kind of cute, which is just interesting that Taylor was obviously thinking, imagine Taylor back then saying shit.
In 1989.
That would have caused chaos, but still a fun little lyric.
Definitely. I think her image wasn't ready for it yet because of what she was curating. Again, because of how she was going with 1989. I don't think it would have, it wouldn't have ever have made it. But it's great to see that she's always kind of had these lyrics ready to go, but she just wasn't ready to explore them yet. From the recording process onwards, a lot of Taylor's albums, more than ever, have been in conversation with themselves, which is such an incredible feat for an artist. And it just goes to show how well she knows her own body of work, and this has made it even more well known to her, which I think is why it's so easy for her to make remixes and mashups on the Eras tour. She's deeply in all of her work. It is her DNA that she is spilling out onto the page for you. 1989 is an example of that.
Next is obviously Wildest Dreams, and obviously this song is kind of bittersweet song in which the narrator can see the end of the relationship before it even begins, but it's still very hopeful that the memories that will leave them will be something that both of them will cherish. And during the 1989 era, Taylor said that she thinks the way that she used to approach relationships was very idealistic. So she said that she would go into relationships thinking, this one's the one, we'll get married, we'll have a family, this is going to be forever. Whereas during the 1989 era, she was going into relationships thinking, how long do we have on the clock before someone comes along and puts a wrench in it, or your publicist calls and says that this isn't a good idea. And so this song is very much grappling with the kind of effects of her celebrity, and is potentially the other side of the kind of blank space persona, whereas rather than kind of owning this crazy data, serial data, instead it's analysing the effects that celebrity has on relationships and, just wanting to hold on to something real rather than something fake. And interestingly, with Wildest Dreams, this song also samples her heartbeat. And another little thing to note is that this song is, in a kind of weird, unofficial way, a single from both the original version and the Taylor's version, as the Taylor's version was released on September 17th, 2021, before we got Red Taylor's version, which is still wild, due to it going viral on TikTok. Using obviously the original 2013 recording, Taylor then decided to release the Taylor's version of the song. And similarly to New Romantics, Wildest Dreams was also featured on one of the versions of Taylor's version 1989. In the poster, we can also see some of the original lyrics, and they are very similar, but there's some different things about rocking and dancing with you all night and see you in black and white, but otherwise it's quite similar to the release lyrics.
Finally, for this portion of songs from 2013, collaborating with Max Martin and Shellback, we have Wonderland, which is a song that is very much overlooked within 1989. Taylor hasn't spoke about it very often. It has lived as a deluxe version for a very long time. Of course, its themes are inspired by Alice in Wonderland, and a story of a relationship that is very much all-consuming, leads you down this rabbit hole, and you're trying to, again, it is pretty much telling a similar story in a way to I Know Places. You're trying to escape from this feeling of knowing that the relationship is very much doomed from the start. It's full of anxiety, there's a lot of people talking, there's a lot of chatter around it, but still you are willing to go mad with this other person as you try and escape all of that. Unfortunately, as we know, it doesn't have the best end. Once again, we have some original lyrics on the Aquamarine version of Taylor's version of 1989.
Dancing down hallways, screaming, you're the king and I'm the queen. Colours I'd never seen twisting around me. It's very interesting to see how these particular ones appear in different songs on 1989. For example, the You're the King and I'm the Queen, blank space. Colours I'd never seen out of the woods.
Yes. I love that. I turned around to find you and you were nowhere to be seen. There was screaming and lightning and I haven't been back since.
The drama.
Had to leave you there.
The drama.
Know, it's just like,
there was screaming and lightning.
Yeah, it's like,
which...
No, I love...
It's...
I love stuff like this.
That would be more like the bridge, really. That would have replaced the bridge. But for Wonderland, I do think she kind of repurposed or perhaps found that she had already said what she wanted to say in other songs with the King and the Queen, with the colours. And then for that bridge, she just aced it by kind of like having a little rewrite there.
So another integral figure to 1989 and Taylor's journey since then is obviously Taylor's good friend Jack Antonoff. He has obviously become a pivotal producer on this project and everyone since. Interestingly, he said that an integral part of the album was the Juno 6th synthesizer, which he describes as having such a sadness and glory all at once. With Jack, though, there is a slight confusion on which song they worked on together first, because Sweeter Than Fiction was released first, which obviously Jack, so technically that was the first time we'd ever seen Jack and Taylor together on a song that was publicly released. However, Jack credits Taylor allowing him to produce Out of the Woods first. However, officially, I Wish You Would is actually the first song they worked on together.
I Wish You Would is another cat and mouse love song where both parties kind of like long for each other, but neither of them want to admit it, and they pass each other's streets, and eventually they do give in and they find their way back to each other in a very cinematic ending, which is exactly what Taylor was planning. She said it was the first song that her and Jack ever worked on together, so there we have the confirmation from back in the day. And she said they wanted to create a sort of John Hughes movie visual with pining. She explained that I Wish You Would was another way that she'd recently been writing songs, which was basically writing to track instead of writing and then having the song being produced. So Jack Antonoff played the song for her, without lyrics of course, and immediately she said that she could hear the finished song in her head, and she begged him to please let her have that track, let her play it. When she received it and wrote this track, she said that she was on the Red Tour and she basically recorded herself playing the track and then singing the vocals, which eventually became I Wish You Would. She sent it over to Jack, who said that he absolutely loved it.
I love these voice memos that were included on the deluxe version of 1989, and I wish we got more of them. I love that we've got some with Cardigan and TTPD. But these 1989 ones were so interesting because the way that Taylor kind of like prefaced them by explaining what this one is specifically showing, and just her fun little tidbits and just like hearing her kind of raw vocals against the kind of tracks and stuff I absolutely love. And this one is one of my favourites. And fun fact, I Wish You Would is my favourite song on 1989.
It is a very good one. It really, really is. And I'm glad that she did give us these voice memos for what she did, and that she did really show how much she did for this album. And I really do think that this is the effect of what happened during Fearless/Speak Now. I really do think that she was still feeling that effect of being like, I will never be told that I haven't done what I've done again. And even so, people will still try and come for her and say, oh, she doesn't write her own songs, or she doesn't do this, or she doesn't do that. How many times does she have to prove herself? For us, it's a very interesting thing because we get to see all the background details and behind the scenes of songs like this, which will always be so interesting to see how she crafts music. Again, this reminds me so much of when we did do our Folklore and Evermore retrospective, and we went over some songs, and Aaron Dessner would send her a track and she would write it and send it back to him like 20 minutes, an hour later. Jack on his end said that he did some experimental sampling of the snare drums on Fine Young Cannibal's 1989 single She Drives Me Crazy, and the final track is a remix that contains the distinctive snare drum.
So going from one of my favourite tracks to another, one of my all-time favourite Taylor tracks, next is obviously Sweeter Than Fiction. So as mentioned previously, this track was originally released in October of 2013 for the soundtrack of the film One Chance. This track is based off of the true story of the British singer/actor Paul Potts, and One Chance is basically about his quick rise to stardom after being featured on the ITV show Britain's Got Talent. And although while promoting it in last October for the deluxe Tangerine vinyl variant of 1989 Taylor's version, Taylor mentions that it was the first song that her and Jack had worked together, and that even though it is obviously about Paul Potts, it can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And even though I've always been a firm believer that Sweeter Than Fiction belongs in the Red era, and a long-time listeners will know my annoyance at that, I am glad that it has found a home on 1989, and I do think it does belong there and fits very nicely.
Yeah, I guess it came out with these sessions of them working together. Again, Taylor mentions it just recently. Last year she mentioned it as being the first song that they made together, but we know that I Wish You Would was made before, or at least...
Yes.
I guess maybe made together.
Maybe, yeah.
In the sense
and also
that
maybe like...
to get
released and probably fully produced and done and sent out.
Yeah, it's a different kind of process than to write with tracks.
Exactly. Their names have been on a song that was out in like that was the first time the public had seen those two together.
Yeah, definitely. So I do kind of feel that it does have a good home on 1989 because of that. However, at the moment, we don't have full access to it as it is still locked behind the Target exclusive vinyl. And once again, as you said, moving some of your favourite tracks to my favourite track of 1989, Out of the Woods. This song is just such an amazing song. It describes, again, this very fragile relationship, and it's full of anxiety and so much fear. And it's something that, again, as you can see, we're repeating the same themes and the same story over and over again. And even though it is very sonically cohesive, and even though it's 1989, it does explore like this theme once and again, it doesn't feel repetitive. I understand that there are some staples and some things like the repetition of some words, and how, 1989 gets a lot of criticism, or at least it did back in the day, for being like, people would say, oh, the lyricism isn't as up to par as Red or Speak Now. But honestly, I think it's perfect as it is. You've got to remember, it's a pop album, and I think that she did an amazing job with the lyrics. One interesting thing that she said about the era, and when she would sit down to write lyrics, especially with Max Martin and Shellback, they would say to her, okay, can you take that lyric and kind of like, you need to cut it down a little bit so we can say it in this amount of beats, or do it in this time. And I think that's an amazing exercise for lyricists and for writers, to have to say everything you want to say, but convey it in a shorter way or in a more concise way that will fit the beat of a pop song better. But going back to Out of the Woods, as Jack said, he said, after I Wish You Would and Sweeter Than Fiction, we did Out of the Woods. So that kind of like gives us that it was the third thing that they worked on together. And he said that it was probably the easiest thing that they worked on together. Once again, he sent her the track for it, and she would send back a voice note with the verse and the chorus. And he said it was just perfect. It's eerie how similar it is to what the final product is. So again, Taylor wrote to track and then sent back basically the finished version of the song. Out of the Woods lyrically also sets up this amazing, masterful use of repetition and desperation through the repetition of that question. It's such, are we there? Are we out of the woods? Are we out of the woods? And in the end, you kind of like reach the conclusion that no. And this is something again that she mentioned in the prologue of 1989. You will never be out of the woods. There will always be something haunting you. I think this song really is a major key for 1989 for me. The way that the clean secret message is in the music video for Out of the Woods again ties up the whole era together. And of course, it produced that blue dress, which we would see once and again, and even was referenced in 1989 Taylor's version all those years later.
Yes.
As for production, the main snare Taylor described is a combination of white noise blowing out an EMI board, dropping a bag on the floor and clapping hands, which is something that is so Jack Antonoff. He's so experimental in his production. I think 1989 obviously is an example of that, but as time goes on, I really do think that their work together has just become something on a different level. The production that he does for a lot of Taylor's songs really lends itself to her lyrics, and while I love these songs where that she wrote to track, and she's doing it the other way around, right? Her lyrics are molding into the production of the song. Mm-hmm. When it's produced the other way around with songs like Bejeweled, yeah, that's it. You knew I was going to go there. You can just really feel that Jack has taken into account those lyrics and has been like, okay, hold on, I will produce the sound of what you're saying. I love that. I absolutely love that. But again, like I said, this is a difficult way as well, where you have to do it the other way around, flipped. Like Taylor could hear this and say, okay, this sounds to me like anxiety. This sounds to me like running away, fleeing into the woods, or out of them, perhaps. The last little tidbit about this song is that later on, it would of course go on to be sampled in question.
So the next Jack Taylor track is obviously You Are in Love, which was inspired by Jack's relationship at the time and what it's like when you find real love, no longer the kind of chase or back and forth, and instead a stable relationship. Later on, ironically, this song went on to inspire the Love and music video. I think what's interesting about this track is that obviously Taylor was writing it by being inspired by Jack's relationship. However, he didn't realise it was about him until much later on in the process. But yeah, it's a fun song. Again, a deluxe track that was lost for a while, but then had a resurgence with things like the Love and music video.
And again, it makes sense that it is a deluxe track because it doesn't really fit that main narrative of the music, because it is a very different love that is being described. No longer are we talking about the chase and the back and forth, breaks that cycle, and is very much more like this idea of pure love, as she said, in a stable relationship. All in all, from what we've seen up to now, despite the loss of the Album of the Year Grammy that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode being the push that Taylor needed, it does seem like, as Taylor had mentioned, she really did have quite a clear vision of the way that she wanted her fifth album to go. Until now, we've spoken about everything that she seems to have made in 2013, and as you can see, it was a lot of material. But the last pieces that came together in 2014 of 1989 were absolutely pivotal for the album to become what it did become. In 2014, Taylor began to work with Ryan Tedder, and Ryan Tedder again was a very pivotal producer of both the original version of 1989 and also Taylor's version of 1989. He also returned and collaborated on I Know Places and Welcome to New York. And here we have again a return of a specific date for a song. We know that I Know Places was at least recorded or completed on January the 22nd, 2014. And we know this because Taylor had it on a Polaroid picture in the 1989 booklet. This song is another reflection on navigating relationships that are highly scrutinized by outsiders and the effects of fame on those delicate beginnings of relationships, which I guess we've always known that I Know Places and Wildest Dreams and Blank Space explore these ideas, but I don't know, 1989 is so like polished that you don't see it in that same way that you see songs like Peace or Anti-Hero.
Often, I think that's the thing with 1989 is that people, if you take it for face value, it's a pop record. I think often the reason why the criticism, even at the time and even sometimes now, not so much so now because it's kind of become like so iconic and beloved, it was that people were taking it as a pop record and therefore there's no depth and no, nothing of any substance. Whereas actually, when you look at the kind of theming and the lyrics and stuff, there is so much depth, there's so much substance. And this is a perfect example of that this is replicating things that are explored in Peace and explored in other kind of Taylor songs that are seen as these amazing lyrical masterpieces. And, I Know Places was exploring a very, very similar thing just with a pop beat on the back. Whereas if you stripped it down, there is so much kind of like rawness and emotion to this song. And I think Taylor's voice memo, again, mentioning the voice memos where she's kind of playing it over piano to send to Ryan, is so haunting and really shows those kind of vulnerable feelings that are being explored.
And again, the way that she describes it, like you said, is very, very similar to how she described Peace in the Folklore Long Pond sessions. She says, like, no one is going to sign up for this. There are just too many cameras pointed at me. There are too many ridiculous elaborations on my life. It's never going to work. What would I say if I met someone really awesome and they were like, hey, I'm worried about all of this attention you get, so I wrote this song. In this case, she's saying, listen, I know places we can go to. I know we can run away, we can hide. And in Peace, it's just basically the elongation of that. It's the continuation of that. I know these places, but even so, I can never give you peace. She found that out over time.
Even the production lends to that. Even though Taylor writes this song basically being like, hey, this is a way of saying to someone, look, we can survive with all this attention, all this heat. The production is that it starts with a kind of tape, like a click of a tape being recorded, but ends with the tape being recorded. So even though she's kind of been vulnerable with someone like, I know places we can hide, she's still being listened to, she's still being recorded, she's still being hunted, which I think is such an incredible production.
Honestly, goosebumps. That is one of the best parts of this whole song, like the way that she wanted it to sound like very urgent, very spy movie, very the rest of it. But the biggest like impact in the whole song are those two little clicks of the song. When you realize what they are and it all comes together, you really feel like, oh my god. Again, these tiny details that really show how much thought and care were put into everything. Finally, Ryan also does sing on this song, and he recorded his takes on his tour bus. The other song that Taylor produced with Ryan Tedder is Welcome to New York, which again, we know the exact date that it was completed, January 23rd, 2014, because of the original lyric sheet, which has been available for a long time, but then was also featured in the Taylor's version editions as well. This song was released on October the 20th, 2014 as one of the promotional singles for 1989, and it's interesting because all of the proceeds from the sales of this single went to New York City public schools. It really shows how important New York was for this album. It's something that we've mentioned before, that she moves to New York just before and then during the 1989 era. She's basically established in New York. It acts as the opening track to the album, so it's quite important to set the scene, and it really does. It conjures the vivid imagery that she wants to relate to the music, as well as sets the standard for the sound of the rest of the record. The song, of course, is a love letter to New York itself, and it describes it as a place full of really exciting new possibilities that are waiting to be embraced. And I think that is what Taylor wanted 1989 to represent. These are all these new possibilities. This is heartbreak, but it doesn't mean the end of you. And this is how you can be reborn in physical form, in a real place as you move, like physically changing up your image and appearance, and also mentally in how you deal with some of the biggest things that maybe detracting from your life. Speaking to Yahoo Music back in the day, Taylor described how New York had inspired her by saying, "I wanted to start the album with this song because New York has been an important landscape and location for the story of my life in the last couple of years. I approached moving there with such wide-eyed optimism and sort of saw it as a place of endless potential and possibilities. And you can kind of hear that reflected in this music and in this first song especially." Again, the lyrics to this song really are kind of like meta in the way that she describes her own life. She's saying, "It's a new soundtrack. I could dance to this beat forevermore." And it's not just referring to like just music in general. She is referring to her own music, 1989. It's a celebration of everything new that was set out in front of her. And the lyrics are also a celebration. She wanted them to be a celebration of freedom and uniqueness, which is represented with the line "boys and boys and girls and girls," which Taylor again described as writing the song when gay marriage became legal in New York. She mentioned that had been something that many of her friends had been scrutinized over, especially when they came out. So she didn't want to make a big deal about it, but she really did want to incorporate it into the song. Once again, like we mentioned, we got the original lyrics in one of the 1989 Taylor's version, and we also had them prior to that. They had existed. They were in one of the museums, but the changes are very, very minimal. Again, Taylor produced this song alongside Ryan Tedder and Noel Zancanella for both versions, both originally and the Taylor's version. Originally, Taylor brought the idea to Ryan, and she mentioned that she wanted it to have like an 80s sound. That prompted him to buy a Juno 106 keyboard and produce the song on the fly, creating a demo. According to Ryan, in an Entertainment Weekly interview, he said that he produced 4 versions of Welcome to New York, but he said that Taylor was so in love with the demo that no matter how hard he fought, she always brought it back to the demo. And he said that's something that happens a lot of times with artists, that they really like become attached to that original version. So what we hear nowadays is basically what they produced back on that first day.
I would love to have a bit of the Lakes orchestral version and just hear what those other versions were like, if they leaned more into an 80s sound, if maybe they were slightly more stripped back, and what the kind of layering of production and vocals and stuff was. I always find that fascinating, because both of us are fascinated by the production and the story and history behind the songs and how they're formed and stuff. And I think that, original lyrics are so key, but also demos of songs and, different alternate versions are just so interesting and so fascinating. So I hope one day we get to hear even just a sample of some of those.
The last producer in the 1989 puzzle is Imogen Heap, who honestly I cannot see 1989 existing without her because of that one track that they did together. It perfectly ties up all of 1989 in that last track, which is Clean. Once again, we have a specific date. We know that it was written and recorded on February the 9th, 2014, thanks to the 1989 booklet. This song is basically a description of getting over a relationship that has very much deeply affected you and comparing it to an addiction, building new patterns, embracing new opportunities in life, finding it hard, but accepting the flood which you ultimately come out of the other side of clean. Taylor mentioned that she wrote this as she was walking out of Liberty in London, and she said that someone that she used to date, it hit her that they'd been in the same city at the same time for a couple of weeks, and she hadn't even thought about it. She said that when that hit her, she was like, "Oh, I hope he's doing well," and nothing else. Not only does Taylor relate this song to a relationship, but she also feels like she can also relate it to the reclaimed narrative of her relationships and how she had reshifted the focus during the 1989 era back onto her music, rather onto all of these narratives that had come about during the Red era. I think Clean has been such an important song for Taylor throughout a lot of different eras. Reputation, during the Reputation Stadium tour, Clean was a big moment when she played it in one of her shows, a very important date. So it is a song that represents so very much. Again, can very much be related to This Is Me Trying, in the way that it kind of like deals with that idea and that metaphor to a certain extent, and then like the real idea of addiction and how in very many different senses, realistically to substances, and then to people and to relationships and to different kind of like feelings as well. Imogen Heap is of course the producer of this song, and she mentioned that they met up at her studio in London and Taylor turned up with the bare bones of Clean. She'd written the lyric, the chorus and the chords. Imogen said that she thought she was absolutely brilliant. Imogen also revealed that Taylor did only 2 takes of the vocals, and the second take was the one that her and Taylor's mum Andrea loved, and that was it. The instrumentation of Clean is on another level. Like, this is what I mean when I was talking about like having a song that has been produced after the lyrics have been made, and this is like one of them. Like, Imogen Heap uses boom whackers and the mbira, and they're just 2 instruments that really heighten the lyrics. It all sounds really watery and all very like, oh, it's just so good. It represents it so well. Love the production of this song. Taylor also got Imogen to sing background vocals, which heightens it again.
Yes, and one thing I always loved about in the day was when we used to get the karaoke versions, because they were just the versions without Taylor's main vocal. However, it still had all backing vocals. And to this day, sometimes I go back and listen to Clean, and where you can really hear Imogen's vocals and how gorgeous and haunting they are, and even things like All Too Well, where you can hear like Nathan Chapman's vocal and stuff. It's so interesting. Like, I find them fascinating. As a kid, I used to put on the karaoke version, just sit there and listen to all the like background vocals, and Clean has always stood out. When you really hear those gorgeous Imogen Heap vocals in the back, you're like, wow, the way she elevates this song is on another level.
When Taylor released Taylor's version of 1989, Imogen also put up a post saying, "This is Taylor playing a badass card to stay in control of her work in a commercial music industry that largely works against musicians. Thank you, Taylor, for inviting me to join your world." And she, of course, also produced Clean, Taylor's version. That leads us to the last two songs from 2014. These two were, of course, the last two, but also I really do think like the most important in concluding that pop perfection 1989. Firstly, we have Shake It Off, which once again we have a specific date for, February the 15th, 2014. This is the most light-hearted song in the entirety of the album, and of course it's its lead single. Taylor said that one of the main things that she wanted to do with Max Martin is they wanted to go into the studio and make something that didn't sound like anything that either of them had done before. She hadn't ever gone with horn sections or Motown vibes before, and neither had Max, and they built this song from the ground up and turned it into this very like obvious chorus that kind of like has all of these horn sounds, which Taylor said that she was very scared to put into her music previous to that moment. In a Lover Diary entry from February 22nd, 2014, Taylor mentions that, "This week I've been in the studio with Max and Shellback every day, and it has been the most creatively successful and fulfilling time. The first day, Shellback just made a really up-tempo drum beat because we decided we needed something up and light. We worked on it for a few hours before I just started singing Shake It Off, Shake It Off, and then the best way I know how to describe it is that the chorus just fell out of the sky. It ended up being this song about doing your own thing, even though haters are gonna hate, and you just have to dance to your own beat. We all went home and I wrote the first and second verses and bought them the next day. We wrote this chanty cheerleader bridge that I absolutely love. We spent all day doing vocals and the next day recording background vocals. I think it'll end up being the first single, and Max said it's his favourite song he's ever been a part of." That just gives me chills whenever we read like Lover Diaries like that, entries.
Those Lover Diaries are like, the gift from God. They were just so interesting and just revealed so much about stuff that happened in Taylor's career, and filled in, just like the Taylor's versions do, and filled in so many elements of the puzzle, and just gave us dates of stuff, and just so many interesting tidbits of really, really integral parts of her career. And yeah, it gives me chills when I read it. I'm like, oh my God, you know, the fact they were creating this like pop classic, you know, like that, this mega pop hit, and just, you know, the way she's just writing about it in her diaries. If it's like, yeah, cool, we just had really fun and created this really cool song. You created like one of the biggest pop songs ever.
Yeah, that's it. That is it, really, isn't it? That you look back at this and it was just such a big moment in the, like, if you stand back and you see this, it was just such a big moment for music, for Taylor's career, for becoming known. This is the song that internationally probably she's most well known for. I mean, Love Story is there, but on an international scale, this is the song that is on all pop radio, like forever. This is one of the biggest songs that Taylor has ever put out. Interestingly enough, Shake It Off has a lot of history behind it, a lot more we could get into. For example, it was a part of a big lawsuit that went on for very many years, that then never came to be because it was settled in the end.
The documents revealed even more.
Yes, it's really interesting to deep dive. It was a very lyrical lawsuit. It wasn't so much the production of the song, it was much more the lyrics and how there was this fight between who came up with Haters Gonna Hate. And Taylor, honestly, it was so interesting to go through all them papers. Maybe perhaps one day we could go through it all and kind of like
definitely
go over how it all came to be and how they were defending themselves. Ultimately, one of the most interesting things that came out is that Max Martin, obviously, both him and Shellback and Taylor, they all had to, you know, give deposition and speak about and give their statements. And he said that Shellback started out with a drum beat, and then Shellback, Taylor, and they all collaboratively developed the melody and other lines of Shake It Off to Shellback's drum beat. However, he then states, "I did not write or provide any input into any lyrics in Shake It Off, which were written entirely by Taylor." I guess we do know these things because it makes sense. Producers many times have to have lyrical credits as well.
They insist on, writing credit.
Because if not, they don't get paid the same. And it's a lot of things, again, that goes on behind the scenes. It's interesting, isn't it, when, you know, the chips are down. And
I think what's interesting is that, like, Taylor is often you know, like, she's always been said, like, how much weight is she holding in these writing sessions? Is she really writing anything? You know, like, even though, as we've said before, there's so many songs that she's written by herself, like, come on, get to grips. But what's interesting is songs like this, Shake It Off, which a lot of people would think, how much of that has she written? Because, you know, it's such a massive pop hit. The fact that basically she did write all of it, it's just like, that's mad, you know, that she crafted that in her head and that was all her. And I think that whole lawsuit, like you said, at some point, hopefully, if we get some time, we'll definitely have to deep dive into it, because it's really interesting, the stuff it revealed. Even the fact that it revealed that bodysuit she wore on the Billboard Music Awards for 22 was a bodysuit and not a t-shirt. Yeah.
No, definitely. I
stuff like that.
Honestly, it was so interesting, and it made me have a much bigger appreciation for Shake It Off than I ever thought I could have. Yes. It made me see, this I think was one of the catalysts that made me see, like, 1989 is much more thought out than you could ever imagine. Even just the silly hate is gonna hate, it has so much cultural stuff behind it and going on with that lyric. It was really, really interesting. I do hope we could do that one day. Yeah, I completely agree. As for the production of the song, it also doesn't pale in comparison. There's so much going on. Again, we've already mentioned how Taylor had previously not wanted to have horns in any of her music, but here they are. Also, we have videos from that era where Taylor and Max Martin and Shellback's screams and stomps were recorded.
Like stomping on the floor, yes. It was like a iTunes exclusive video, I remember it. And it was, and it came out before the album. It was like after Shake It Off was released, it was definitely on iTunes. And I used to just sit and watch it, and I was like, this is so fascinating. The fact they were like stomping their feet on the ground and just going like, oh. And it's so cool.
I also really loved the part where they're singing the ba 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 ba, which she said they very like wanted to make it obvious, a bit out of tune, a bit like kind of like
wedding singery.
Yeah, like who cares? We're all very like carefree in this part, because that is what they wanted with this song, and that is what was Taylor's vision. She said, you know, this song will be a song for people who haven't got up to dance yet. They will get up to dance at this song. This is a song that everyone can just kind of like relate to and just like...
Yeah, even your gran.
Yeah, and feel happy just like listening to it. And she did such a good job. Finally, a little fun fact is that another thing that was used in the production was a cigar box with strings.
And to round off the 1989 songs, we obviously finished with Style, the last song made for the album, which was kind of made, recorded, written on February the 19th, 2014. And I think what's really interesting is obviously she wrote Clean before Style, which I think is just a really interesting kind of like chronology, because she's supposedly clean, but you know, she's definitely not over it. The song is kind of comparing a relationship to staple styles and trends that just never seem to go away. And Taylor said that she loved comparing these timeless visuals with a feeling that never goes out of style. And basically it's one of those relationships that's always a bit off, and the two people are trying to forget each other. Recomparing it, Taylor kind of recompares this song as well to previous ways that she's viewed relationships in her previous albums, similarly to how she did with things like This Love, and shows that in previous albums it's kind of always been like I was right, you were wrong, you did this, you made me feel this way, and more of a kind of righteous sense of right and wrong. Whereas with things like Style, she basically realised that what happens when you grow up is you realise that rules in relationships are very blurred, and it's very complicated and very quick, and there's not a case of who was right and who was wrong, and that was what she was playing around with the kind of relationship of styles and trends.
And again, it's funny how this is the last song on the album, and many times Style is lauded as pop perfection. Like, a lot of people think of this song as like the pinnacle of pop, especially on 1989, of course. And yet she did have to go through all of the creation of everything else, and also, you know, the loss of the Grammy, stabilizing her vision for what 1989 was going to be, and finally coming to the creation of this song, which is such an important part of the whole album. Once Taylor had made Shake It Off and Style, she knew that the album was then complete. While the focus of this retrospective has mainly been on the details and the creation of the album and everything we wanted to highlight of the track by track, we also wanted to go over some of the important moments from the overall 1989 era, because in many ways it is an extension, a representation of the music. So firstly, I think the most important thing to say is that her approach to promotion was full on. Taylor was everywhere.
Full throttle.
Yeah,
it was every talk show, every magazine, every advert, every like brand deal. It was nuts.
Yeah, she wanted to frame that narrative of her new album. She wanted it to be a musical and a personal rebirth. Visually, she wanted to be seen in her image that she had changed, and because of that she had to appear everywhere in order to do that. Like, this was such a big shift. It really, really is a big shift in genre. We don't realize because now so many years have passed and all of her previous albums have kind of like, they're already established in pop. But imagine just having 3 albums out, or 4 albums rather, 3 that are, you know, purely country.
Heavily country.
1 that is borderline half and half, but has still been promoted as country, and then completely saying, that's it, I'm letting go of that because I am going to do this shift in genre. I'm going to introduce this new music and style and keep it in people's minds.
Oh yeah, it was mad. Like, that release day, I'll never forget listening to it, shoving it in, getting the CD and shoving it into the laptop. And just like, it was just like, wow. I was like, this is so different. And I know it's so silly because it sounds so Taylor Swift now, but at the time it was so vastly
very different
sonically,
it really
lyrically, was. And even just like the booklet, like of the CD and the photo shoot was just so different to anything she'd really done. And I think it really marked a real change. Like, even though the difference between Speak Now and Red is still distinct, 1989 really set in motion of like the very distinct eras and totally letting go of everything you've done before and like reinventing yourself, which then she went on to do Reputation, Lover, Folklore, you know, very, very, very distinct eras. And 1989 I felt like was a real full-fledged attempt at that in a way that was just like stripping down everything you've done before and like starting from scratch, reinventing herself.
She was definitely becoming a pop icon because of all of the hard work that she put in. And this is something that a lot of people say about Taylor when they speak about her, when they have worked with her. She is so hardworking. That was like detrimental in a lot of ways to her mental health and to how she was being perceived as a celebrity, which again, you know, made its way into her music and into her personal life in many different ways. The main thing is that, yeah, you could not escape her. She was everywhere. And when she wasn't on the telly or, you know, doing interviews on magazines, she was then on social media, especially on Tumblr. As we've mentioned many times throughout this episode, she really connected with fans on a much more of a personal level. It kept her grounded, I think, and tied to fans while simultaneously coming into a new era of stardom, which is such a stark contrast. Like, she was inviting these people into her very personal spaces and then turning around and going on to like Grammy Awards and Victoria's Secret launches and hanging out with like very, very, very famous people. It's such a contrast.
Yeah, because obviously this kind of birthed the creation of the Secret Sessions, which went on for the next 2 albums after this, where she was inviting fans to her house to take a look at, to listen to this music and interact with her. And then she obviously did things like Swiftmas, where she sent fans, you know, Christmas presents. She was very, very controlled and personally picking fans to attend events or meet her before and after events and things. Yeah, there was a very much a personal touch, even though it became like this massive pop, very polished release and era, there was still this massive element of personality and her being very in control and at the driver's seat of all of it. And fans were kind of very appreciative of that, and they were very protective of her. And especially when 1989 had leaked online prior to its release, fans were extremely protective of making sure that music did not get released, and very, very thingy about the fact that art is something that you should pay for and is valuable and shouldn't be leaked. Something which I think some people could do with being re-reminded of nowadays, but back then it was like, you know, we were guarding the gates of the release. No one was getting it before it was supposed to be, which I think was because fans were so appreciative of their connection with Taylor and how personal she was being online. Some
other interesting facts from the era is that the name of the project, as you said, Taylor was very much trying to be very protective of this music from, you know, not leaking, which is something that she has always taken very seriously. The name of the project for 1989, as in the way that Folklore was named Woodvale or Evermore was codenamed November, 1989 was codenamed Sailor Twips. Another big thing that obviously was so important during the 1989 era was to have massive singles, and they were constant singles with accompanying music videos that were just like we mentioned before. They were cinematic. There's a lot going on in these music videos. This was a step up and beyond, mostly because it marks the first time that she begins to work with Joseph Kahn, who became a very important collaborator when it came to Taylor Swift music videos. And Taylor would learn a lot of directorial skills from Joseph Kahn, honestly. Like, she took on a lot on board when she was producing these music videos in the 1989 era.
I think because he worked very closely with her, he involved Taylor a lot in the process, whereas often with kind of directors and stuff, artists will have an idea for a music video, put that out to directors come back with a treatment, which basically is like what they think the music video should do, almost like storyboarding the music video, and then basically they decide, yeah, that sounds cool, and the artist just says and does their stuff, mimes to the song, and it's done. Whereas Taylor was very heavily involved with Joseph Kahn, and he was very heavily involved with her of creating this very, very specific image that she wanted. And I think that's especially the case with things like Blank Space, where when you watch those behind the scenes, which also led to an app, we had the Blank Space app where you could go really behind the scenes.
An Emmy Award-winning app, no less.
Yes, an Emmy Award-winning app, yes. It was so interesting, and you got so many more behind the scenes things, and you could click on things in the music video, and it was like a kind of virtual music video that you could walk through. But in that, you can see all the behind the scenes of how involved she was with him. And like you said, I think this was where Taylor started to get a hunger for directing.
The singles from the 1989 era and the directors of the music videos are as follows. Shake It Off was released on August the 18th, 2014, and the director of that music video was Mark Romanek. Blank Space was on the 10th of November, 2014, with Joseph Kahn. Style came out on the 9th of February 2015, directed by Carl Newman. Next up was Bad Blood on May 17th, 2015, once again with Joseph Kahn. Wildest Dreams followed that on August the 31st, 2015, again with Joseph Kahn. Then we had Out of the Woods, once again with Joseph Kahn, on January the 19th, 2016. And finally, to close off the era, we had New Romantics on February the 23rd, 2016, which was a 1989 World Tour compilation directed by Jonas Ackland. Speaking of the 1989 World Tour, again, performances. Taylor was, of course, performing so many of her songs. Shake It Off, she performed like thousands of times at that point. And of course, we had the 1989 World Tour in 2015, which was just like, it took over. Again, World Tour very much loosely, because it was not Speak Now World Tour, and it wasn't an Eras tour for sure, but still.
No, it definitely wasn't. But I think what was interesting was the fact of how many people were brought onto that stage. Like, Taylor let everyone and anyone up on that stage, whether they're a musician, a sports star. During Style, she would just bring up everyone, and then there was so many artists and so many collaborators that she brought up to sing their songs, and she kind of gave them space. And I think it was because she was becoming this, that was when she really became like this major pop superstar with all these kind of celebrity friends and all this kind of influence. The 1989 era was nuts, but then obviously that was then recorded and then put on Apple Music on streaming, and I believe has kind of fallen off of Apple Music and is now just kind of freely on YouTube. So if you have never watched that,
you can find it.
I highly recommend. The editing is rogue, and that is a whole other discussion for another day, but it's still stellar. Like, those performances are just elite, and Taylor's vocals, it was really when her kind of vocal and performance and kind of choreography and pop stardom was just when she really, really nailed it and was really leaning into that. I think what's interesting as well, along with 1989, is the way that it was marketed was also very different to previous albums. Whereas before there had been, say, like one version, like one standard version and then one deluxe version. With 1989, there was then 5 versions that had Polaroids that you didn't know what the Polaroids were, and therefore it was like a collector piece. It was like Pokemon cards. So it encouraged people to go out and buy multiple versions. I think it was when we were really starting to move into like digital music, and like at this time buying on iTunes, which obviously then phased out into Spotify and streaming. And I think this was Taylor encouraging people to buy art and buy music, and people were very supportive of it, and everyone wanted to, get all the different Polaroid packs. And the way that 1989 was packaged was very intentional, and is obviously then led on to things like Reputation and Lover and Folklore and subsequent albums that have had multiple versions and had incentives to buy multiple versions because of things that was included. And 1989 was the first true example of that. Obviously previous albums had different country versions, like in terms of like a Japanese version or a UK version or French, but that wasn't like a heavily marketed thing and wasn't necessarily intentional. It was purely just regional. Whereas 1989, those 5 or so versions were very intentional and released everywhere to encourage people to buy, to get those massive first week sales.
2 of the main points that we've discussed just now, the 1989 World Tour and bringing out all of those people on it, and then also the importance of the move between like physical and digital music. 2 of those things are some of the most controversial parts of the 1989 era though there was a lot of high points, there's also a lot of underlying issues going on, especially in the latter years of the 1989 era, which would eventually lead to, well, 2017 and then eventually Reputation. Firstly, obviously, we have the idea of the squad. Taylor was very eager to surround herself with her peers and cultivate especially female relationships back in that time. But her squad was deeply, deeply scrutinized for many different reasons. And I think one of the things that she touches on with them Reputation poems is that no amount of friends at 25 will ever kind of like make up for the lack of people that were once around you at a younger age. I'm paraphrasing here one of the poems, but it is true. That is the idea of what you said. She brought out so many people during the 1989 World Tour. She would platform them, she would defend them, she would really ride for them, and then when shit hit the fan, it all broke down into pieces. Yeah, they did. Fair weather friends. Other ideas obviously to do with the squad. They were criticized for a lot of different reasons, not just that. Of course, that was more on a Taylor personal thing, but they were also very much scrutinized for representing a very stereotypical kind of image of a white skinny female. Behind the scenes, once again, there was much more going on with that image than any of the press could have imagined. On another note, we had, of course, the streaming disputes between Taylor and both Spotify and Apple Music because of their unfair compensation for artists. In November of 2014, Taylor removed her entire catalogue from Spotify, and she basically said that she wasn't happy with how they provided such small royalties to songwriters.
I think it's mad that she is now like a Spotify
giant
and general streaming juggernaut. Yeah. Whereas back then, like even Reputation, it wasn't released on streaming in its first week. Like that's just mad to think about now. And back then was even then when streaming was kind of an infant really in comparison to what it is now, was still a massive move and quite scary. And her open letter to Apple was so interesting because it persuaded Apple to totally change what they were going to do. They were going to have those first 3 months or so unpaid. And Taylor said, look, I might be able to afford this because obviously I'm, a giant in the music industry. But, a smaller artist starting up, they can't afford to go unpaid. And no one should have to go unpaid for a service that they're providing and art that they're creating. And the only reason she was able to do this and pull out and, write these open letters was because she was part of a smaller indie label. She mentioned that friends like Lorde had expressed concern about this, but because they were part of, Universal and had deals where their voice was slightly silenced, they weren't able to publicly dispute this. Whereas Taylor, because obviously she was started Big Machine up from the ground up really with Scott Prosciutto, she was able to argue that, and now obviously because of her status has been able to argue kind of different things in her new contract. But it's just interesting how now she works so heavily alongside Apple Music and Spotify. They are massive. She's massive on there, but back then she pulled everything, which is just nuts. I remember my dad's Spotify, and you'd go on Taylor Swift's profile, and the only things on there was I Don't Want to Live Forever, Highway Don't Care,
Both of Us,
the Both of Us, the Should Have Said No, like Jonas Brothers live version, and there was another one. There was one more, I believe, that was on there. It was just the most random songs, and that's one of the reasons why I Don't Want to Live Forever has so many streams, I think, on Spotify, because for a long time it was the only thing on there.
Yeah, and her whole catalogue didn't come back until June of 2017, and like you said, Reputation was held off from streaming services for that first week of its release. And it's all because Taylor has always found that just like the physical idea of an album is still very important. And I agree, like it's such an important thing for artists. I know streaming is so comfortable. I'm glad it exists. I'm glad that we can all kind of access music, but she's always had this idea of like the art and the pain and the everything that is put into an album, and to have it in a physical format is also always a nice thing. And she does put her heart and soul into it. She even sketched out and drew that little Big Machine car logo in her own hand, as her own drawing. The font of this album is her own writing. Like she went through the process.
Her heartbeat is in
the album. This is it. She went through the process of writing out every single letter in her own hand to be able to use it as a font on this album. Like I guess this isn't the case for every single album and every single artist, but with Taylor, she does put her heart and soul into designing an album that you will want to collect. So I'm glad that we have that. But also I'm glad that she found a way to bridge that gap into the streaming era and finally made it to number 1 on Spotify. Unfortunately, this all led to kind of a bitter end of the era of 1989. Mostly, Taylor even commented, which is so sad to hear when she does comment in interviews towards the end, that she knew that she had to go on a break soon because people were becoming tired of her. She had several public feuds with Katy Perry, Calvin Harris, and of course the Kim Ye feud was the nail in the coffin. With the release of Famous and the backlash that came from that infamous horrible line and music video, and Taylor coming out to kind of defend herself, saying that she did not want to be part of the narrative, the snake tweets, the edited video, it all came together really, and Taylor ultimately took a very different route and a very different outlook on fame, friendships, love, and life after 1989, after this reinvention and rebirth. She took a step back and eventually would come up with a reputation. What a crazy turn of events. What a 180 from the start to the end.
I think what's so interesting is that she had to reinvent herself for 1989, and through the process of reinventing herself, almost destroyed herself.
Wow.
And then had to restart again. It's just so interesting that she almost kind of created this... She didn't, but it's almost like she created this kind of thing that became bigger than herself, and almost this monster that then destroyed itself, that she had to kind of start again. It's just, through her, not her own fault, it was because of, backlash, and just she kind of unfortunately ended up on a bit of a hate train in kind of 2016. But as a fan back then, it was, I think it's only if you were really there, you realise how awful it was. And like the fact that she's been able, like now, the fact she's so loved and everyone loves her, it's just like, God, honestly, back then, it was a totally different picture.
It really was.
It was just another level. If you're a Taylor Swift fan, and it was the abuse and torment you got off people, like people were so visceral and angry and hated her, and she was this manipulative, evil person that was like this awful, calculated woman, and she was fake, and it was nuts.
So frustrating because it's like, can you not see the images that are laid in front of you? Like, have you seen that disgusting music video? Like, how are you going to commission a naked wax figure of a person? This is revenge porn. This is absolutely disgusting. And yet,
vile.
And yet, no, but she said that was okay to say bitch on the album. Even if she had, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you want to take back something, if you feel bad about something, when someone's getting a whole stadium full of people to say F you, I made you famous. I'm sorry, I did. I was a ride or die for Taylor, and I still would.
Always will be.
But it was such, like you said, it was such a horrible time, like in the fandom, like just people coming up to you and would say things about, oh, didn't she do this, didn't she do that? It all really, she gave so much of herself, and people took and took and took, and then they got tired of it and decided, no, this is all a trick, this is that, you can't be that way. And it just like exploded in her face, which is such a bittersweet moment now to see how Reputation is kind of like, people beg for it. And when in the 1989 era, we didn't even know what was going to happen next.
We didn't know if she was ever going to, she broke that 2-year cycle, which at the time was like wild, and we had no idea what was coming next. We didn't know if she was ever going to come back.
Such a fragile time for her.
Time where it's like, is something, like we just had no idea. It was mad. I remember when she did like a little video for some basketball guy where she had like her curly hair, and it was like, wow, we hadn't seen her in, we just hadn't seen her in so long. It was like mad at the time. But yeah, it's one of those things it's hard to describe unless you're really there, how like she was just on top of the world with Shake It Off Blank Space style and Bad Blood, and then like by the end of the era, she was literally the most hated celebrity online.
It's so horrible, and I'm glad that she came out of it the way that she did. I'm very, very thankful that how she was able to take that all on board, and I hope that has served as a way to show people that be more cautious of the things that you see and you say online, especially. These are still people. How are you going to paint a mural, cancel someone?
It was awful. It was so awful. I just remember it as a fan. It was just like heartbreaking every day I'd go online. It was like, just leave her alone. You know what I mean? It was just like, just leave her alone. Like, can we not just...
There's much to be said about celebrity and being perceived as not a person, just as a thing that people can like comment on as if you were a piece of garbage in the news. I hate it. It's horrible. I'm glad that everything did turn out how it did. If Taylor wants to talk about it for the rest of her life, she's very, very much entitled to. However, we now reach the final part of this whole journey, which luckily leaves us off on such a sweeter note than that one. It would have been a bit sad to be able to, to have to conclude this episode on that note. But with Taylor's version and the re-recording of 1989, she really did reclaim that album in many, many different ways. The change of aesthetic, it really shows no longer is this mysterious reinvention of herself having to be the front of the album. Now she has no longer anything to prove. It's much more open, it's much more freeing, it's much more positive.
Big smile.
She made it out to the other side. The original 1989 strived to be a lot, but Taylor's version doesn't have that pressure or anxiety over it anymore. The music is free to basically speak for itself. It also included some of the original cut photo shoot, which is an amazing way to tie them both together and bridge the two albums into one. The foreword of the album, of the Taylor's version album, is also so important. It gives such a great amount of perspective of the original era. Looking back and saying, you know, it wasn't fair that I was basically shipped with all of my friends. It wasn't right that I had to go be under so much scrutiny at such a young age. There's a lot of good things and optimistic things that can come out from this era. I think 1989 was always very, very important to establish who she was in the music industry, who she was at her record label, and who she would become as she continued to reinvent herself throughout all of her eras.
Vault tracks. They were all produced by Taylor and Jack Antonoff. Amazing production, I must say. Incredible. They really, really expand on 1989 in so many ways. They show such a more vulnerable side to the entire album. Honestly, I think some of these, if not all of these tracks, could have easily been a track 5 in the 1989 framework.
To be honest, they're probably more track 5 than the actual track 5.
Exactly.
Sonically and sometimes maybe even, thematically.
Yeah, lyrically, honestly, I do think they all are very, very raw, very, very open. They also all delve into the lore of the album and give us so many new lyric parallels to analyze.
They're like the Red Vault. Speak Now didn't feel like that for me. It didn't feel like it really added anything because the story of Speak Now is so many different stories that it's not like one succinct, that I didn't feel like, oh, okay, that makes sense to that and that makes sense to that. Whereas this was like the Red one where I was like, oh my God. You know what I mean? Like, this makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, this just adds more to the story.
It's so interesting when that happens, isn't it? Because it's like, oh my God, you can connect this with this and this with that. Most of these do sound slightly more jaded or raw sounding than the rest of 1989. The major overarching reasons to why these songs were left behind in the first place, bit too revealing. And Taylor has kind of said and mentioned before that she wanted this album, and she even mentions it in one of the songs, that she wanted this album to be much more mysterious.
Some of their sentiments are dealt with in other songs, and I think that other songs maybe, even though these deal with it really well, I think the other song is like, okay, that was definitely its competitor, and I understand why it was chosen.
Yeah. Ultimately, I do think that it was a good call to leave these ones off, because the climate of 2014 when 1989 came out was very different to what it is now in terms of just the world in general, and also to how the world regarded Taylor.
Like even the word slut, like I can imagine, like obviously she said it in the Vogue interview, but like that was a little bit later.
Yeah, I know.
But like in 2014 off the back of like being a country singer.
The shit she would have got for that.
Yeah, she just couldn't have said that. Like she couldn't have said, if they call me a slut, I don't care. Taylor kind of mentioned that in the prologue, that she was so glad that fans understood what she wanted, and that fans knew what she was doing, fans knew where she was coming from, and you know, totally understood the direction and the metaphors and what she was talking about, whereas sometimes the general public or critics didn't. And I still think that it makes sense why these were cut off, because I think they would have been too honest, it would have been too raw. And it was at the time when she was doing all this promo where she was being asked about these songs.
We open up the vault with Slut, which is such a jarring title and a bit of a baity title, to be honest with you. It's a very happiness kind of song where you expect one thing and it's not that, really. So it was written by Taylor, Jack, and Patrick Berger, who is also credited as a producer. And Taylor's quote on this, because she did also release some audios in which she talks about 3 of these from the Vault tracks. She basically mentioned how it was like a cheeky play on the discussions about her at that time in her life and her dating, which she mentions that she also does in Blank Space. And ultimately, she basically says that she picked Blank Space over this. She also mentions that it was more of a dreamy and California type of song, whereas 1989 in its original form was much more New York. So she wanted to stick to that theme.
The original album is so like New York in its photo shoot, in its rollout, in just every aesthetic about it, which is so interesting because now the whole aesthetic is like beach.
She mentioned in the prologue where she said, and reclaimed in 2023. And not just reclaimed in the sense of the album itself being a recording, but
it has a Taylor's version on it,
I think it's also very... I know this is very mushy of me, but I think she's reclaiming herself from that era as well, because she went through so much in that era. So much.
Oh, yeah.
And this is very
that prologue is very telling.
Yeah.
With Slut, Slut was a surprise for me because I expected it to be more on the blank space side of almost like going into it rather than basically, I don't care if they call me a slut because I'm so down for you.
I think this one was a bit too on the nose, but at the same time, not like scathing enough.
And not in a way that could be kind of jokingly kind of played out as a character.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't really play out a character of someone that doesn't care that they're being called a slut because they're in love with someone. Like, it's not as like easily digestible as like her actually playing into the character. This is psycho girl.
Definitely.
The music video, the tour performance.
I think it would have been very much misconstrued as well. And
I think it would have been totally taken out of context.
Yeah. We move on to the second song, which is Say Don't Go, the Diane Warren co-write.
Sometimes it's quite fun when you have someone a bit different because you just get something a bit different.
You do. You do. Liz Rose, Imogen Heap, Diane Warren, these female lyrical collaborators, they're just so good. Diane Warren was very excited about this. Taylor sent her some flowers and she gave a small interview in which she kind of gave a few quotes, and she mentioned that Taylor was very particular about how she said certain things and how when she was writing this song she wanted the lyrics to be like just so, because she was thinking about the listeners and was deeply aware of what her fans wanted to hear. She also mentioned, I love little tidbits like this, she mentioned that it was written towards the end of 2013 and they recorded a demo on New Year's Day of 2014. And
she was like blown away that Taylor was like that hardworking that she would like do that on basically a day off. Diane Warren is like so glad that it's released. She wants it to be a single because she thinks it's a hit. She it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I feel like this, especially the chorus, feels the most like 1989-y, like how you get the girl kind of like fun pop song, like I love this song. I think it's so cool. From first listen, this one really stuck out to me.
Thematically, it reminds me a lot of All You Had to Do Was Stay. And I wonder if that was the competitor, in my opinion. That could be possibly why. All You Had to Do Was Stay was earlier. It was written before in the process. So perhaps she was kind of revisiting those feelings or, somehow wanted to write about that kind of sentiment again. But a lot more devastating, I think, to be honest, though.
Yeah.
I say I love you,
more
you say nothing
more
back.
Vulnerable. Narrative and sonic. I think the shouting, like, say, is very similar to, like...
Interesting, yes. Yeah.
They mimic each other that, it would have been like, okay, I feel like sonically and thematically, lyrically, All You Had to Do Was Stay did it.
Next up, we head into Now That We Don't Talk.
Taylor said it well, like, this song packs a punch. Like she said, like, it might be short, but it's time on this earth, and it's little 2 minutes 50, whatever it is, 2 minutes 30, it serves in those the little time it has. It is perfect.
It's so good. It's just like Taylor and Jack again working together on their best, as they always are, on their A game, definitely for this one. It's so short, but it has so much in it. The production is so good. So like you were saying, Taylor did mention in those little recorded snippets that she wrote it towards the end of the process and couldn't quite get the production right in time. And like you said, she said it was the shortest song that she's probably ever put out, but it really goes in and it makes its point. I believe the outro is the reason we didn't get it back in 2014. Perhaps a little too scathing, considering circumstances. But I don't have to pretend I like acid rock or that I'd like to be on a mega yacht with important men who think important thoughts. 2014 us were not ready for this. This little part after that, which is, and the only way back to my dignity was to turn into a shrouded mystery, which is 1989, just isn't it? It is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100%.
The album. So again, maybe a little too on the nose to put on the album. The next song is Suburban Legends, which again, Taylor and Jack working together. And for me, it does feel like the most mysterious one. We also don't have any clarifications from Taylor or any co-writers or whatever, and it's the one that reminds me the most of Midnight's.
It literally is mastermind.
Yeah.
Like that verse, that first verse, when you listen to it, for me, it sounds like mastermind. And even the pronunciation in like the chorus and stuff, just so mastermind.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely see, like you were saying, and just like we said with Fearless, how Folklore felt like an influence to some of the production and even lyrical changes, because we know that in a couple of the songs, a couple of things were changed. In this case, it does feel like there was like reciprocity between the influences of Midnight's, but from 1989 and on 1989 from Midnight. And that leads us to the last song on the album, which is It Over Now? Also a Taylor and Jack song. Very, very, Taylor and Jack are just 1989, aren't they? Really, that's where they started off, and you can tell that they really are very, very comfortable in that kind of era and that sound, because they just do it so well. I can't argue when she said that this vault was insane. She was correct. But anyway, Taylor's quote about this song is that it's a funny play on words to use as an album closer. That is why she kind of put it as the last song. Like, is the album over now? Which she's done before with songs like Begin Again, and even on our song where she put it there on purpose because of the Play It Again lyric. So she does love a little play on words. She characterizes this song as the sister song to Out of the Woods, and I Wish You Would.
It is so Out of the Woods. Like I generally think this is why this one was left off, because the whole like 20 Stitches in a hotel room, and obviously Red Blood White Snow. Yeah, hospital room, hotel room. Yeah. Hospital room. My excitement, I'm butchering the lyrics.
That's fine.
Yeah. But yeah, that's why I feel like it was left off, because it is, like you said, it is the sister to Out of the Woods, and then I Wish You Would, which also it kind of mimics that thing that she said about how the relationship that 1989 is talking about was about someone that you feel like could interrupt your wedding.
Yeah.
Because it's never really over. Yeah. And that's what this song, like, is it over now? And was it over then? And is it even over now? That's kind of what she's saying.
Yeah. Another reason why I think it may have been left off is I also see it as a sister song to Style. But obviously all of those songs are connected anyway. But
like with The Model, some other girl.
Exactly. Yep, there you go. And it's a relationship that keeps going around and around. Is it over? No, it's not. Now it is. Now it's not. And the revelation of...
Yeah, then are we out the woods? Are we out the woods?
Exactly. The revelation of trying to get over someone or make them jealous by being with, other people. The lyric on Style, it summarizes the whole vault as well, because there's a lot of like emotions from Slut also come up here. At least I kept my nights in secret, although they were rumors about my hips and thighs and my whispered sighs.
The studios where she recorded Taylor's version of 1989 were in Aldo, Brooklyn, Big Mercy in New York City, Conway Recording in Hollywood, Electric Lady in New York, The Hideaway in London, Hutchinson Sound in Brooklyn, Kitty Committee in New York, London and Belfast, which is of course Taylor's personal recording studio movable one, Mandarin Oriental in Milan, Pressure Hill in Portland, Prime Recording in Nashville, Rough Customer in Brooklyn, Sharp Sonics in Los Angeles, and finally Studio 112 in Johnstorp. As for 1989's legacy, it really did turn Taylor into a pop icon. Many people call it like the pop Bible, pop perfection. It really reinvented synths in music in this era. It had record-breaking sales, record-breaking Grammy Awards, and Taylor's version pushed Taylor over the edge to become the #1 artist on Spotify, and it also debuted over 1 million copies sold for the second time. So this album is recognized by everyone in the general public. It changed her career and her life, both for, in some cases, worse, but mostly for the better. It set the standard not only for her work in pop music, but also in general, how pop music was going to be made, both then and now. Taylor basically set out to make a cohesive body of work, and she not only achieved that goal, but she also cemented herself as a staple in pop culture, as she did. The most important thing, obviously, tying this episode all together, is that while Taylor did lose the album of the year for Red, ultimately, a couple of years later, she stood on that stage. She received the album of the year for 1989. Is ultimately what she wanted to do. She created this album very much knowing what she wanted to do and what she wanted to win. And it just goes to show that when she put her mind to it, she really did. She did it.
Before we finish the episode, I just also want to say a massive thank you to Lisa. She has compiled all of this information. And lovingly, like, the document is nuts. Like, I've been a little bit MIA the last couple of weeks. So big thank you to Lisa. All of this has kind of come from her massive research and our kind of collaborative brains. But yeah, it's the document is mad. So yeah, thank you for all of the research and effort you put into this episode, because I feel like we've definitely done it justice. 1989 is such a juggernaut of an album.
It really is.
And there's so much to talk about, but I feel like definitely with everything you've written, everything we've chatted about, I think we've definitely done it justice and highlighted it for all of its amazing qualities and, you know, its impact.
Thank you. As always, you always come up with all of the little fun facts and tidbits from the era.
I've always got weird and wonderful,
yeah.
personal experiences and random little info.
All in all, like you said, 1989 was such a massive album. Taylor knew this. With Taylor's version, she said, I knew we really needed to get this one right. It's been such an important album in my life. So for you to have embraced it the way you did, become the biggest debut sales week at that point in her entire career, she was blown away. And honestly, it just goes to show 1989, it really was such a big era. And I think forever she'll be remembered from these songs and from this album. So we hope you enjoyed this episode. We hope you enjoyed the celebration of 10 years of 1989, 1 year of Taylor's version. Please let us know, what are your favourite songs from 1989? How are you celebrating? Are you listening to the album? What are your favourite memories from back in the day, the original era, and also from last year, which was such an amazing time this time last year with the Eras Tour film and 1989 all out at the same time. It really was iconic. But for now, please do give a like to this video if you enjoyed it. Like Cameron said, we put our heart and soul into this one. Also, please subscribe if you do enjoy our content. And if you want to also follow us on Instagram, our handle is @SwiftlySpokenPodcast. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, you can rate us as well. Thank you very, very much for listening. We know that this one was a big episode, so thank you for sticking with us. And we will speak again very, very soon.